if we could see this passage, everything would be moving. And so, yes, this is a story about Jesus and Peter and faith. But this is also a story about wind. And so I wonder how much of our story is a story about wind. Because when I think of wind, I think of noise, and I think of movement. When there is wind, there is noise. When there is wind, everything moves. And so I wonder if we aren't actually a culture of wind. A culture of noise and of movement. A culture that thrives on doing and that must have volume. 3 noteworthy things about the wind. First, the wind literally pushed the disciples away from Jesus and away from silence and solitude. Because Jesus is over here on a mountain alone. He's doing something similar to the silence and solitude we've been learning about in this series. So Jesus is over here doing this. A quick definition. Mike gave a much better and longer one in his previous sermons, but this is a quick definition of silence and solitude. Having both an inner and an outer space to be attentive to God. Solitude and silence is having both an outer and an inner space in which to be attentive to God. And so Jesus is over here doing silence and solitude, and the disciples are here in a boat, but they are literally being pushed away from Jesus. Because, in verse 24, the wind was against them. And I think some of us need to wrestle with the ways in which movement and noise, our need for doing and for volume, are literally pushing us away from silence and solitude. The ways in which movement and noise are literally pushing us away from attentiveness to God. The second thing about the wind is this. The wind could have muffled Jesus' cry of come. Which reminds me, Kyle and Teresa Dillard recently went on vacation to Hawaii. And while they were there, Kyle made a home movie to tell us all about it. So let's take a look. So think about the pivotal moment of our passage. The disciples are in the boat, half asleep, and they see someone walking on the water, and they go, "It's a ghost!" But over the noise of the wind, Jesus replies, "Don't be afraid, it's me." And so Peter shouts back, "Well, if it's you, tell me to come to you." And so we're at that pivotal moment. Jesus is about to call Peter out on the water. Jesus is about to call Peter into a story far more exciting than he could have ever imagined. Into a reality more ultimate than he could have ever dreamed. He looks at Peter and says, "Come." Do you think Peter heard it? Over the wind? With everything moving and swirling? Do you think Peter heard Jesus say, "Come"? He must have. I mean, you wouldn't get out of the boat and try to walk on water unless you heard Jesus say, "Come." So then there's another question. How did Peter hear Jesus say, "Come"? because everything was moving. There was so much noise. This is a story about wind. And Jesus only says one little syllable. Come. How did Peter hear him? And it seems to me there's only one way. Peter must have been so completely focused on Jesus that as his ears heard the word, his eyes read the word coming off Jesus' lips. Come. And surely, with all the wind and all the movement and all the doing, with all the sound, with all the volume, Peter had a lot of other things he could have focused on. There was a lot to distract him from that word. Come. There was a lot that could have muffled that word. Come. Peter had to be fully attentive to Jesus to hear. Come. And I think we're like Peter. I think Jesus is calling us to a far more exciting way of life. A far more exciting story than most of us are living. Jesus is saying to us, come. Come to me wherever I may be, no matter how crazy it may seem. Come. And I think that the wind, the noise, and the movement of life has muffled that call. It's not that Peter is called to walk on the water and I'm called to have a Christian sun visor. I think that Jesus is calling us to a story, to a faith as exciting as Peter's, but that we can't hear the sound of sheer silence saying, come. Come to me. And then a third point about the wind. The wind did not stop until long after Peter stepped into the exciting story to which Jesus called him. The wind did not stop until long after Peter stepped into the exciting story to which Jesus called him. In fact, the wind didn't stop until Peter and Jesus got back in the boat. In other words, the wind is not going away. The noise and movement of our culture will not stop anytime soon. Our culture will continue to impress upon us the high importance of doing, and it will continue to assign our worth based on what we do. But we sort of say to ourselves, well, when life slows down, or when there's less noise, when there's less movement, when things calm down a bit, that's when I'll start being more attentive to God. Then I'll be able to hear Jesus say, come. But in our deepest selves, I think we can affirm that our cultural pace is not about to slow down. We are not a few months away from ending our cultural addiction to volume and doing. The wind is not about to stop anytime soon. And further, the passage this morning shows us that Jesus is calling us even as the wind blows. Jesus is not waiting for the movement and noise to stop before he calls us into a more exciting story. And so if we can admit that the wind will not stop anytime soon, that our culture will continue to be a culture of noise and movement for quite a while, then we must commit ourselves to two things. We must commit ourselves to devoting time to be attentive to God. That is, to silence and solitude. And we must devote ourselves to listening for Jesus' call to come. As individuals, we must devote ourselves to these things. As community groups, we must devote ourselves to these things. Here's a radical idea. As families, we must devote ourselves to these things. Because we are living amidst the wind.